We are continuing to watch how the politics of impeachment could impact the 2018 midterms and, of course, the 2020 presidential election to come. More than a dozen Republican politicians, activists, and consultants tell Politico they are increasingly convinced a Democratic House victory in the midterms and subsequent impeachment push would actually help the president in 2020. Quote, proponents of the go for broke scenario argue that Trump's at his best when his back is against the wall, and that a move to impeach would both rally the base and make the president sympathetic to moderate voters. Of course, it's not just Republicans who think that's the case. Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi has repeatedly warned her caucus about the dangers surrounding the impeachment threat. Here she is back in April.
I have said over and over again that I don't think that we should be talking about impeachment. I discourage any discussion of impeachment. On a political side, I think it's a gift to the Republicans to talk about impeachment.
And here's former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon in an exclusive interview with MSNBC on Friday.
When they say they're not talking about impeachment, it's because they've looked at the crosstabs in the polling. And they understand when we put impeachment on the ballot that it is a way to get all of the deplorables out. Even if the congressman in your district is a rhino, that you have to come out to support President Trump.
Joining the conversation, Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass of California. Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. So I want to start with what we just talked through there. Do you agree with Nancy Pelosi that this conversation around impeachment is something that should be, put off, that should not be the centerpiece of the 2018 midterms for Democrats?
Well, I certainly don't think it should be the centerpiece. But at the end of the day, an individual running has to work their district. And if that's an important issue in their district, but I really think that most voters want to hear about why should you elect Democrats? Why should you put Democrats in charge? What are you going to do if you're in charge? I really think that's the more important issue. Where
do you think the energy of the Democratic Party is right now? I mean, Tom Steyer has been running around the country doing impeachment-related events and has reportedly drawn crowds of hundreds in places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you wouldn't normally expect a crowd like that. Do you think that that's where the energy is, and that many people need to make sure that they at least try to embrace that?
Well, I do think that in some areas you find the energy there, and he's certainly finding it in areas that you wouldn't expect. But when it really comes down to it, when you're actually talking one-on-one with voters, they want to hear about health care. They want to hear about jobs. They want to hear about how you are going to make their life better. And yeah, impeachment, the investigation, Trump, all of that is of interest. But when it really comes down to the conversations, they want to know about themselves and their communities.
I want to ask you about, again, Nancy Pelosi has come under fire from Republicans. She has said, they spend all kinds of money against her. They demonize her. She is, of course, raises a lot of money. She defends herself as somebody with many legislative accomplishments. Setting that aside, if in fact she were not to be, either because she couldn't or because she decided to step aside, did not become the next Democratic leader, would you ever consider running for that post?
Well, actually, it's not something that I have thought about, but let me just tell you that I do think within the Democratic caucus, there is a lot of talent. There's a lot of talent. There's new folks coming in. There's people that have been there for a long time. There's this concept of a bridge. I think there's a lot of discussion going on in our caucus right now.
Do you think you could serve as a bridge like that? Potentially, or not?
Well, it's not actually something I thought about. I did serve as Speaker in California, but, I'm looking to be helpful to the caucus and doing whatever I can to bring people together. I serve in a role right now where I deal with the rules of the Democratic caucus, and I've tried to take on that position in a way that brings people together. So my focus has not been on that. My very serious and honest focus has been on getting those seats, and I live in Los Angeles, where we have a lot of seats right around my area.
Right. What about Jim Clyburn? He is, of course, currently the number 3 in your caucus, and he sort of floated the idea of potentially being that bridge that you mentioned. Do you think that would represent generational change?
I think Mr. Clyburn is one of the most revered and respected members in our caucus, and the concept of a generational change is something that people are absolutely considering. When you are talking about a generational change, I think in some respects people are referring to age, but in some respects people are referring to people who have not been there for a long time. I believe what Mr. Clyburn is considering is the idea that he would serve for a short period of time as a bridge, and I do believe he's one of the most respected members in our House.
At this point, what do you think is missing from the Democratic message in the fall that your leaders should be talking about more?
Well, I actually think our message is pretty strong. I mean, again, we're running on what we would do when we would get back, and the number one thing is health care. You know, the Republicans have been killing the Affordable Care Act one step at a time, and we need to absolutely deal with prescription drug prices. We need to deal with pre-existing conditions, the advertising so people know to sign up for the Affordable Care Act. Jobs, it's great that unemployment is down. However, you know, in many places in the country, people are working 2 and 3 jobs. People need to make more money. And so looking at those two things, I believe, are number one and number two in terms of the issues that we should focus on.
All right. That's sort of, sometimes is not always how this campaign plays out. We have this ad from House Majority PAC I want to show you, and we'll talk about it.
They've shut down the government, resigned in shame, paid hush money, and tried to end Medicare and Social Security. Here's who Republicans might have to answer for next. Jim Jordan. Remind you of Joe Paterno? Kevin McCarthy, Paul Ryan's protege with a lot of baggage. And Steve Scalise, linked to KKK leader David Duke. No wonder they aren't looking out for you.
Is that ad fair?
Well, I think there's a lot of facts in that ad, but it is a negative ad, and I would certainly like to see us run on a more positive message. That might be an ad that's focused in a pretty heavy Republican district where you're really trying to critique the Republican leadership and say, you know, they've been in office now for a long time, and what has that gotten us? Not very far. So I really think that as Democrats, we need to show that we are for the people, for the average person, not just passing tax cuts for the wealthy, which is what the Republicans have done, taken away health care. They couldn't repeal it, but what they've been doing is murdering it, death by 1,000 cuts, and we need to do what we can to repair the Affordable Care Act and improve it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.